Hello everyone, this is our team. Moore Pollock from the University of Haifa, Samson Tu from Stanford University, Reid Hochberg from Rambam Medical Center, Raviv Alan and Netanel Al-Qaeda from the Technion Institute of Technology. I am Alexandra Kogan from the University of Haifa, and today we're going to talk about GoCom, a goal-oriented methodology for treatment of patients with multimorbidity and its preliminary evaluation. We have no commercial relationships to disclose, and this paper was accepted to the Journal of Biomedical Informatics as of September 6th. The main learning objectives for this presentation include understanding goal-oriented modeling, understanding different types of interactions among patients' goals, and learning about strategies for detection and mitigation of the conflicted goals. The learning objectives can be further discussed after the presentation. So why does a guideline-based clinical decision support system need to address multimorbidity patients? Multimorbidity patients are becoming more and more prevalent as the average age of the population increases. Treating a multimorbidity patient can be very complex and require large amounts of knowledge, which can be extremely overwhelming to the practicing physician. Physicians consult clinical practice guidelines where they can find information relevant to the patient's specific condition, thus making the burden of remembering everything that is needed to treat the patient easier. Also, clinical practice guidelines can be computerized. There are multiple formalisms available for encoding guidelines. One of them is the Performa formalism, which we rely on in this work. The resulting computer-interpretable guidelines make large quantities of information available to the physician in a helpful and concise way. However, clinical practice guidelines and the computer-interpretable guidelines that are based on them mostly focus on one single condition and do not take into account the many interactions among conditions as well as medications that will inevitably occur for a multimorbidity patient. A simple example can be seen on the right side of the screen, where a patient that was prescribed aspirin for cardiovascular disease prevention has developed duodenal ulcer. The duodenal ulcer guideline recommends to stop aspirin, thus leaving the cardiovascular condition untreated. Our methodology is goal-based and focuses on detecting and mitigating conflicts among the multiple comorbidities of the patient. That is why we named it GoCom. Multiple researchers have previously addressed this problem and offered interesting solutions. As we can see in the figure on the right, one approach uses constraint programming and the other uses action tasks and rules to detect interactions. However, these solutions often offer a narrow range of treatment options with very specific mitigation operators, such as replace specifically aspirin with specifically clopidogrel. A more general approach would be considering the goal. For example, to prevent stroke, we want to search for a drug that reduces platelet aggregation. With this approach, we can search the guideline and medical ontologies for alternative drugs. Our methodology is also modeled according to standard ontologies and terminologies. In addition, it utilizes general medical knowledge from external sources. Those aspects help make the methodology generic, reusable, and scalable. Our approach, being goal-based, also helps us reason over the patient's goals in guidelines as well as ontologies. This makes it possible to automate the process of finding alternative solutions. Here we can see a graphical description of the system that is modeled according to the Model View Controller architecture design pattern. The model contains guidelines encoded using the previously mentioned Performa formalism and external medical knowledge sources, including the National Drug File Reference Terminology, the NDFRT. It also contains the patient's database that is modeled according to the HL7 FHIR resource standard. The system has a controller algorithm with different behavioral patterns that help it to reason over the input that it gets from the other components. The controller initiates the Performa guidelines and then retrieves the patient forest, which it can use to detect and mitigate interactions. The interface of the system is implemented as the view component. In addition to the novel approach to goal-based modeling, another novel aspect of our approach is the patterns implemented by the controller, as well as the combination of a multitude of aspects to create a system that allows generic and automatic conflict mitigation. Here we see an example of a cardiovascular disease guideline modeled in Performa according to our methodology. The Performa formalism has 4 different types of tasks: A plan task represented as a red round-cornered rectangle shape that contains other tasks in it, including other plans. A decision task represented as a pink circle shape that has different candidates that could be chosen when a decision needs to be made. An inquiry task represented as a green rhombus shape that helps us collect data about the patient, and an action task represented as a blue square shape that states what action needs to be taken. While the encoded guidelines are just one part of a much larger system, because Performa currently doesn't support goals, we developed a new methodology for encoding guidelines in a goal-oriented way. Plan and action tasks are used as goals, while inquiries and decisions retain their previous purpose. The guidelines are hierarchical, with the high-level goals on top. As we can see in the example, a high-level goal would be secondary prevention of cardiovascular disease. A lower-level goal would be decreased platelet aggregation, which is a physiological effect goal modeled according to physiological effects in the NDFRT. The lowest-level goal is the action enactment goal to start aspirin. Each goal has a type and subtype. The types were inspired by a paper from 2006 by John Fox, where he developed an ontology for goals. The first type is a state achievement goal that can be a treatment prevention or physiological effect goal, where we want the patient to achieve a certain state. The second type is an action enactment goal that states what action needs to be taken to follow the guidelines recommendations. There's also a knowledge type goal that is usually used for diagnosis. All the goals in the guideline are tagged with a meta property that corresponds to the addresses attribute of the goal object in the HL7 FHIR standard. This meta property consists of a verb and a noun phrase that contain all the information our algorithm needs to know about a goal, including ontology codes and preferred names from the ontologies that we utilize. Here we can see an example case study of a patient that has cardiovascular disease and has developed duodenal ulcer due to taking aspirin. Later, the patient developed osteoporosis, and this is when our story begins. Now that the patient has received a new diagnosis, there are 3 goal trees that correspond to the conditions of the patient at this particular stage. In the cardiovascular disease goal tree, we can see that the patient is treated with aspirin for secondary prevention of cardiovascular disease. In the duodenal ulcer goal tree, the patient was prescribed omeprazole, which is a proton pump inhibitor, for secondary prevention of duodenal ulcer. And in the osteoporosis goal tree, we see that the guideline recommended to stop taking proton pump inhibitors for secondary prevention of osteoporosis, since proton pump inhibitors are a known risk contributing factor for osteoporosis. Together, the 3 goal trees form the patient's goal forest. Now we see that a conflict has occurred with one guideline recommending the use of proton pump inhibitors in the yellow marked goal in the middle with the green start, and another guideline recommending to stop proton pump inhibitors in the white square on the right with the red stop. The algorithm mitigates conflicts by producing copies of the patient's forest with alternative solutions, by either finding alternative guideline recommendations to satisfy the conflicted goals or canceling one of the conflicted goals. This is the first copy of the patient forest. Here, the algorithm reran the osteoporosis guideline, found no alternative recommendations to stopping proton pump inhibitors, and so in this copy, the recommendation to stop proton pump inhibitors was discarded, and the patient keeps taking omeprazole and aspirin. Here we have the second copy of the goal forest, and in this copy, we cancel the active goal, so the proposed mitigation is to accept the recommendation of the osteoporosis guideline and to stop proton pump inhibitors. This is a third copy of the goal forest that is created when one of the patient's goals was recommended to counteract the effects of another goal. When this dependency link is identified, the algorithm performs a rollback and reruns the guideline that recommended the source of the dependency. Here we can see that omeprazole was prescribed to counteract the effects of aspirin, and so the algorithm reruns the cardiovascular disease guideline that recommended to take aspirin in the first place. When the algorithm finds an alternative recommendation, aspirin is replaced with clopidogrel in this copy of the patient's goal forest. Clopidogrel was previously not recommended because aspirin is the guideline's first choice. Now that aspirin may need to be replaced, clopidogrel can be considered. In addition to replacing aspirin with clopidogrel, in this solution, since omeprazole was given to counteract the effects of aspirin and aspirin is no longer needed, the goal recommended by the duodenal ulcer guideline to take omeprazole can be completed, and with it, since we're stopping the omeprazole, the goal recommended by the osteoporosis guideline to stop proton pump inhibitors can be completed as well. After the copies of the patient's goal forests are created during mitigation, they're combined with explanations generated by the algorithm and are presented to the user as aggregated option sets. The algorithm generates explanations for individual goals by retrieving textual justifications from the guideline, like the explanation for clopidogrel that we can see at the bottom left corner of the screen, as well as generating explanations automatically, like the explanation for the completion of omeprazole that we can see in the bottom right corner of the screen. For auto-generated explanations, the algorithm uses an attribute of the goal fire object called the life cycle status, which includes statuses such as the ones we have seen here, where goals can be active, completed, or rejected. Explanations are also auto-generated for an entire option set. We can see an example at the top of the screen. Option set explanations contain information on what goals were satisfied or unsatisfied in this particular option set, and what are the treatments that the option set recommends. The functionality of our methodology was evaluated with 6 realistic, complex multimorbidity case studies that were developed by our medical experts. Usefulness was evaluated with 2 studies. 1 pilot study with 10 medical students and 2 case studies, and 1 study with 27 medical students and 6 case studies. The usefulness of the system was evaluated for completeness and correctness. Completeness is the percentage of clinical treatments proposed by a participant out of all the clinical treatments specified in the gold standard. Correctness is the percentage of correct clinical treatments proposed by a participant out of all the treatments that participant proposed. The studies have shown that use of GoCom has increased completeness and correctness with statistical significance. In addition, the explanations and visualization provided by GoCom were perceived as useful by the vast majority of participants. To summarize, we've developed a goal-based methodology that utilizes standard ontologies and terminologies and helps detect and mitigate different types of interactions among the patient's goals. In the current implementation, GoCom detects interactions between action enactment goals as well as physiological effect goals. When conflicts occur, they're mitigated by producing alternative copies of the patient's goal forest, and then, either by finding alternative guideline recommendations for the conflicted goals, or by discarding one of the conflicted goals in each copy. Additional copies of the goal forest are produced when dependency relations are identified between medications. The algorithm combines the copies of the goal forest with generated explanations and presents them to the user as aggregated option sets. Explanations are generated for individual goals as well as for the option sets. And so, the evaluation has shown that the system that we implemented according to our methodology increased completeness and correctness with statistical significance. Finally, future work will include in-depth modeling of temporal aspects as well as adverse events and goal prioritization. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll be waiting here for your questions and comments after the presentation.